another confession to make. I'm your fool. Everyone's got their chains to break. Holding you. Were you born to resist or be abused? Is someone getting the best, the best?
In 1993, Ruth Watson Lubick received a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship. She purchased an abandoned supermarket in Northeast Washington, D.C., an area at the time that held the top spot in the nation for infant mortality. Known to the community as Little Vietnam, this neighborhood also had a legacy of drug-related homicides. Let's listen to Ruth as she speaks of building trust in this community.
I've spent a lot of time trying to develop trust with the community. Washington is divided into wards, and we're in Ward 5 right now. But it's also, then the wards are divided into advisory neighborhood groups. And so I went to as many of those as I could, but always took with me, actually I usually took one of the employees of the Healthy Babies Project with me, who was black, you know, and who would introduce me, you know, and then I would show the film. And this is because we wanted not to have opposition to what we were doing, you know, just because of lack of information. So we did that, and then when it came time, you know, and then the building, you probably know, are aware, it was given to us, and we raised the money to renovate it. But we had an architect who was not African American or anything, and he came around one day with paint chips. You know, this is what the color of the building is going to be. He had elevations and he had paint chips. And I looked at him and I said, "You're not going to decide what color the building is going to be. We need to ask the women in the neighborhood, you know, because they're going to, once this place is up and open, you're gone, you know, but the women have to walk past it every day. They're on their way to the Safeway, you know." So we put together a focus group and we asked them what color they wanted.
And they decided on that purple.
And they'd find, no, not purple, and then lavender.
I'm sorry, lavender.
Lavender,
Yes,
yeah, and that's what, that's right.
Lavender.
And they, and then when I asked them why lavender, finally they said because it's peaceful.
Recent research on spirituality indicates social justice activists are sustained by a perceived sense of relatedness or connection to the work itself and the community. In this next clip, Ruth speaks to this transformative process.
My being empowered is, there was a woman in this project that I told you about, which is called Carver Terrace. And she was the president of the Carver Terrace Civic and Tenants Association. And her name was Veronica Hartsfield, but she traveled under the name of Miss Patsy. And she had had breast cancer, and so she's dead now, but I made very sure, you know, to make friends with her, and because I knew she had a lot of respect and so forth in the community back there. And after we'd been open for 2 or 3 years, I went back to see her, and by that time she was bedridden and so forth, but I said, "Miss Patsy, you know what? We haven't had any graffiti and we haven't had any break-ins." And she looked at me and she said, "I told them, leave it alone."
Lubick's altruism is largely related to living with parents who exemplified these traits on a daily basis.
Being born during the years of the Great Depression, I think, you know, people say to me, "Well, how did you get that way?" And I said, "Well, you know, my mother and father believed that you should try to help people who were less well off than you were. And my father was a pharmacist, and I grew up in the drugstore in a small town in Pennsylvania, and he would hawk my mother's jewelry to get money to buy medicines, you know, to give to people during the Depression. And some of my earliest memories are of going to Philadelphia with my mother, because we lived about 20 miles north of Philadelphia, going to Philadelphia with my mother on the train to get her ring out of hock. the string.
Next, we meet Sister Teresita Hinnigan at her Center for the Empowerment of Women, where she currently is a part of a project aimed at rehabilitating women who have been trafficked for sexual exploitation. Sister T is a medical mission sister, nurse midwife, health planner, and retired professor from the University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing. In 1980, Philadelphia held the nation's top spot for infant mortality. Sister Teresita and 3 other activists from varying professions started a grassroots collaboration aimed at addressing this tragedy. Their first step was to listen.
But the biggest thing, at least what really caught my attention with the early days of Maternity Care Coalition was we were out on the street talking to the women. As I said earlier, they had stories to tell. No one listened. And I remember, if you read my report, my study of North Philadelphia, I give some of the answers of this woman, and one woman said, I felt like a slab of meat. This was in the hospital, because nobody cared. Nobody cared. But to say you feel like a slab of meat because you weren't looked on as important. So we listened to their stories, and then we were able to speak for the women. We became a voice for the women and speak to those who made decisions at the city, Department of Health and at the State Department of Health.
How do you speak to these others who control things? I'm trying not to use the word opposition because you said they're not opposition, but...
What was interesting is Walter and I, after that study, that I did in North Philly, it was from Girard Avenue down to Vine Street, river to river, right? After that, and the Department of Health, we asked them to print it for us because we didn't have a printer in those days. So that's how they read it. And not too much later, there was an infant mortality task force formed. And Walter and I were on that task force. And again, we brought those stories of those women to that task force. We had facts. And Walter came to that meeting every time with a list of what maternity care wanted, from the city of Philadelphia, and changes in, the care for women who were poor, who had no access to the healthcare facilities. It was very difficult in those days to get Medicaid. And unless the woman had Medicaid, it was a white card then, or brought a couple $1,000s, as a down payment, they would be turned away. And there were a few hospitals that were, quote, dumping grounds. PGH was still open. Philadelphia General Hospital was still open in those early days. But then that closed soon after we started. And then Temple became a dumping ground. And it's a terrible thing to say, a dumping ground for people who couldn't pay their bills with, some of the other hospitals. And what was interesting is the administrators of those hospitals denied turning people away. And we brought them facts because we would say we had called and we were turned away, unless we brought money with us. We pretended we were pregnant and, and asked for an appointment. Mm-hmm. And not to skip ahead, but that was one of the biggest things that I think, again, the Maternity Care Coalition did with the mommobiles when they went out into the neighborhoods, was to link the women up with prenatal care clinics so that there was no possibility of them not being able to get an appointment. And I saw that the mommobile, the introduction of the mommobile, one of the important things of, after having listened to the women's story as to what their needs were, that these mommobiles were able to fulfill a lot of those needs.
In the 1980s, Dr. Walter Lear was the Commissioner of Health in Philadelphia and worked alongside Sister Teresita. He was supposed to be in this documentary, but in June of 2009, his battle with cancer returned, and he is currently in hospice care. When I asked him what kept him going all those years with a life dedicated to social justice, his response was an unequivocal love. So, in that same spirit, this documentary is dedicated to Dr. Walter Lear.
The book of love is long and